The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the mahogany conference table as Alexander Chen adjusted his platinum cufflinks for the third time in 5 minutes. The Seoul's skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 42nd floor boardroom, but his attention remained fixed on the slender woman seated 3 chairs to his right. Min-jun Park, his Korean translator for the past 18 months, sat with her usual professional composure, her dark eyes scanning the documents before her with practiced efficiency. What Alexander didn't notice was the almost imperceptible tightening around those eyes, or the way her pen had stopped moving entirely when the Japanese executives began discussing the manufacturing costs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 38, Alexander had built Chen Industries into a multinational empire spanning technology, real estate, and manufacturing. His success story was the kind that graced magazine covers and business school case studies. From a modest upbringing in Vancouver, he had leveraged his engineering background and an almost supernatural ability to read market trends into a fortune that exceeded most small countries' GDP. Today's meeting represented the culmination of 8 months of negotiations with Hashimoto Corporation, a deal that would secure exclusive distribution rights for his revolutionary solar panel technology across Asia. The contract on the table was worth $8 billion. Min-jun had been present for every critical meeting during these negotiations. Her reputation as one of Seoul's most skilled translators had preceded her when Alexander's assistant had recommended her services. She was fluent in 7 languages, held degrees from both Seoul National University and Cambridge, and had worked with heads of state and Fortune 500 CEOs. More importantly, she possessed an almost uncanny ability to capture not just words, but the subtle nuances of meaning that could make or break international deals. The Hashimoto delegation consisted of 5 men in immaculate charcoal suits, led by Takeshi Hashimoto himself, the 72-year-old patriarch whose family had controlled the corporation for 3 generations. His son, Kenji, served as the company's operational director, while his nephew handled international partnerships. They had flown in from Tokyo that morning specifically for this signing ceremony, bringing with them the final contracts and the promise of a partnership that would reshape the renewable energy landscape across 2 continents. Alexander had spent the morning reviewing the key terms one final time. The deal would grant Hashimoto exclusive rights to distribute his solar technology throughout Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore for the next 15 years. In exchange, Chen Industries would receive a substantial upfront payment, ongoing royalties, and guaranteed minimum purchase commitments that would fund his next generation of research and development. It was, by any measure, the deal of a lifetime. The morning session had proceeded smoothly. Both legal teams had addressed the final minor adjustments to the territorial clauses, the payment schedules had been confirmed, and the intellectual property protections had been reinforced with additional safeguards. Alexander's own lawyers, a team from one of New York's most prestigious firms, had pronounced themselves satisfied with every aspect of the agreement. The afternoon session was intended to be purely ceremonial, a formality before the actual signing. As the Japanese team engaged in animated discussion among themselves, Alexander found himself studying Min-jun more closely than usual. She had been unusually quiet during the morning session, offering only the most necessary translations and none of the insightful commentary that had become her trademark. When complex technical terms arose, she typically took the initiative to ensure both parties understood the full implications. Today, she had remained strictly within the bounds of literal translation. The conversation among the Hashimoto delegation grew more intense, their voices dropping to near whispers as they huddled around a tablet displaying what appeared to be financial projections. Alexander caught fragments of Japanese mixed with technical terms, but not enough to piece together their discussion. He glanced at Min-jun, expecting her to provide some context as she usually did during these sidebar conversations. Instead, she sat motionless, her face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. But Alexander had worked with enough people in high-stakes negotiations to recognize the signs of internal tension. The slight rigidity in her posture, the way her breathing had become shallow and controlled, the manner in which her hands remained perfectly still on the table, rather than taking their usual notes. Takeshi Hashimoto cleared his throat and addressed Alexander directly in heavily accented English. Mr. Chen, we have reviewed final projections for market penetration. Very promising numbers for all parties. His smile was warm and grandfatherly, the expression of a man who had built his fortune on the ability to inspire trust. Min-jun translated the response into Korean for the benefit of Alexander's local partners who had joined the meeting virtually. Her voice carried its usual professional clarity, but Alexander detected something different in her tone. A hesitation, perhaps, or a careful measuring of words that hadn't been there before. Kenji Hashimoto leaned forward, speaking rapidly in Japanese while gesturing toward the contract documents. His father nodded approvingly as his son outlined what appeared to be a timeline for implementation. The younger Hashimoto's enthusiasm was evident, his hands moving expressively as he painted a picture of the partnership's potential. Mr. Kenji explains the rollout strategy, Min-jun translated. First phase will focus on premium residential markets in Tokyo and Osaka. They project 30% market share within 18 months, based on their existing distribution network. Alexander nodded, pleased by the aggressive timeline. Speed to market was crucial in the rapidly evolving solar industry, where technological advantages could disappear within months if competitors moved quickly. The Hashimoto family's established relationships with major construction companies and residential developers would provide immediate access to customers who might otherwise take years to reach. The Japanese team continued their discussion, occasionally breaking into English to address specific technical points with Alexander's engineering team via video conference. The atmosphere remained collegial and optimistic, with both sides expressing satisfaction with the partnership's potential. Alexander found himself mentally calculating the revenue projections, imagining the expansion possibilities that would open up once this deal established his company's foothold in Asian markets. But something was troubling Min-jun. Alexander had worked with her long enough to recognize her subtle tells. The way she adjusted her posture when translating particularly complex passages suggested she was wrestling with more than just linguistic challenges. When the Hashimoto team discussed manufacturing logistics, her translations became notably more concise, stripping away the detailed explanations she typically provided. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander noticed Min-jun excusing herself twice for brief phone calls, unusual for someone who typically maintained complete focus throughout extended meetings. When she returned from the second call, her professional demeanor seemed even more carefully controlled, as if she were actively suppressing some internal conflict. The pivotal moment arrived just before 4 o'clock. Takeshi Hashimoto had been speaking quietly with his nephew about quality control standards when their conversation took an unexpected turn. The elderly patriarch's voice dropped to an almost whisper, but the conference rooms, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Acoustic design carried his words clearly to anyone fluent in Japanese. Alexander watched as Min-jun's face underwent a transformation so subtle that anyone less observant might have missed it entirely. The careful neutrality of her expression shifted, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shock, followed immediately by what could only be described as moral conflict. Her pen, which had been moving steadily across her notepad, stopped mid-sentence. The Japanese delegation continued their hushed conversation, apparently unaware that their translator was experiencing what appeared to be a crisis of conscience. Alexander found himself leaning slightly forward, every instinct telling him that something significant was happening, even though he couldn't understand the words being spoken. Min-jun's internal struggle played out in microscopic changes to her posture and expression. Her breathing became more controlled, as if she were actively managing her physical responses. Her hands, previously steady, developed an almost imperceptible tremor. Most telling of all, when she looked up from her notes and her eyes met Alexander's briefly, he saw something he had never seen before in her professional demeanor: fear. The conversation among the Hashimoto team concluded, and Takeshi addressed Alexander with his customary warmth. "We are very pleased with today's discussions, Mr. Chen. This partnership will benefit all parties involved." His English was more stilted than his son's, but his meaning was clear. Alexander waited for Min-jun's translation, but it never came. She sat frozen, staring at her notepad as if the words written there contained some terrible revelation. The silence stretched beyond what could be considered a normal pause, long enough that both delegations began to notice. "Min-jun?" Alexander prompted gently. She looked up, and for just a moment, her professional mask slipped entirely. Alexander saw not the composed translator he had worked with for 18 months, but a woman grappling with a decision that could change everything. "He said," she began, then stopped. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she seemed to be speaking more to herself than to the room. "He said the partnership will benefit all parties." Something in her tone made Alexander study her face more carefully. The other members of both delegations were beginning to show signs of confusion at the unusual delay, but Alexander's attention remained fixed on his translator. "Is there something else?" he asked quietly. Min-jun looked around the room, taking in the expectant faces of the Japanese delegation, the expensive suits and confident smiles, the contracts ready for signature. When her gaze returned to Alexander, he saw her reach some internal decision. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I need to speak with you privately." The request sent a ripple of surprise through both delegations. Takeshi Hashimoto's eyebrows rose slightly, while his son exchanged glances with the other Japanese executives. Alexander's own team looked puzzled by the unexpected interruption to what should have been a straightforward signing ceremony. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess," Alexander suggested, his mind racing through possibilities. 15 minutes to address any final details? The Japanese delegation agreed with polite smiles, though Alexander detected a hint of impatience in Kenji's expression. As the room emptied, with both teams retreating to separate areas for what they assumed would be routine last-minute preparations, Alexander found himself alone with Min-jun in the boardroom that had been carefully prepared for his triumph. The city lights were beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk, creating a backdrop that should have been celebratory. Instead, Alexander felt a growing sense of unease as he watched Min-jun struggle with whatever she needed to tell him. "What did they really say?" he asked directly. Min-jun looked out at the Seoul skyline, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone about to irrevocably alter the course of events. "Mr. Chen," she began, "there are things being discussed in this room that you need to know, things that weren't meant for your ears, because they assumed you couldn't understand Japanese." Alexander felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. "What kind of things?" "The kind that could destroy everything you've built," she replied, finally meeting his eyes. "And I'm the only person in this room who can tell you the truth." The weight of Min-jun's words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Alexander found himself studying her face with new intensity, searching for any sign that this might be some misunderstanding or cultural miscommunication. But the gravity in her expression left no room for such hopeful interpretations. "I've been your translator for 18 months, Min-jun continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "In all that time, I've maintained strict professional boundaries. I translate what is said, nothing more, nothing less. But what I heard in the last hour crosses a line that I cannot ignore." Alexander moved closer, lowering his voice instinctively. "Tell me exactly what they said." Min-jun glanced toward the door, ensuring they remained alone. When Takeshi was speaking with his nephew about quality control, they weren't discussing manufacturing standards. They were discussing how to implement defective components without detection. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Defective components? "The solar panels that Hashimoto will be manufacturing under your technology license," Min-jun explained, "will use substandard materials and critical components. Specifically, the photovoltaic cells will be constructed with cheaper silicon that they know will degrade within 3 years, instead of the 25-year lifespan your technology promises." Alexander's mind raced through the implications. "That's impossible. Our licensing agreement includes strict quality control measures, mandatory inspections, certified suppliers." "Which they plan to circumvent," Min-jun replied. Takeshi was explaining to his nephew how their manufacturing facility in Thailand operates under different regulatory standards. They will produce panels that meet initial inspection requirements but fail catastrophically after the warranty period expires. The conference room, which had felt like the setting for his greatest triumph just minutes earlier, now seemed to close in around Alexander. Why would they do this? The partnership is worth billions to both sides if executed properly. Min-jun's expression grew even more somber. because their financial projections show they can make more money by cutting manufacturing costs and betting that individual consumers won't have the resources to pursue legal action when the panels fail. They're essentially planning to steal your technology, produce inferior versions, and leave you to deal with the reputation damage when thousands of solar installations across Asia fail simultaneously. Alexander sank into one of the leather conference chairs, the magnitude of the betrayal washing over him. "You're certain this is what they were discussing?" "I've been translating business conversations for 15 years, Min-jun replied. "I know the difference between technical discussions and conspiracy. What I heard was Takeshi instructing his nephew on how to maximize short-term profits while minimizing the risk of detection until after the initial payment schedules are completed. The genius of the plan was as appalling as it was comprehensive. By the time the defective panels began failing en masse, Hashimoto would have already received the technology transfer, paid the initial licensing fees, and established manufacturing operations that would be difficult to shut down. The legal battles that would inevitably follow would take years to resolve, during which time Alexander's reputation in the renewable energy sector would be destroyed. There's more," Min-jun continued reluctantly. "They also discussed how to use the partnership as a stepping stone to acquire your other technologies. Once they have access to your manufacturing processes and research data through this deal, they plan to reverse engineer your innovations and develop competing products that will undercut your prices in global markets." Alexander felt the careful structure of his business empire beginning to crumble in his mind. The Hashimoto deal wasn't just the cornerstone of his Asian expansion. It was supposed to fund his next generation of research and development. The upfront payments would finance 3 new research facilities and hire the team of scientists he needed to stay ahead of emerging competitors. "Why are you telling me this?" Alexander asked quietly. "You could have simply provided the standard translation and collected your fee. This isn't your responsibility." Min-jun was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lights of Seoul. "My father was an engineer," she said finally. "He spent his entire career developing innovations for a large corporation, believing that his work was making the world better. When he died, I discovered that his employers had been systematically stealing his patents and selling them to overseas manufacturers who produced inferior versions of his designs. The products that bore his innovations were responsible for several industrial accidents because the knockoff manufacturers cut corners on safety systems." She turned back to Alexander, and he saw pain in her eyes that went far deeper than professional obligation. "I swore that I would never be complicit in that kind of betrayal again. When I heard Takeshi outlining their plan to steal your technology and endanger consumers with defective products, I couldn't remain silent." Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city that spread out below them. Somewhere in those lights were millions of people who might eventually install solar panels bearing his technology, trusting that the systems would provide clean energy for decades. The thought of those consumers being betrayed by products that carried his name was almost unbearable. "What evidence do we have?" he asked. "If I walk away from this deal based on a conversation they assumed I couldn't understand, they'll simply deny everything and potentially sue for breach of contract." "That's the challenge," Min-jun admitted. "Everything I heard was spoken in Japanese during what they believed was a private conversation. They would certainly claim that I misunderstood or mistranslated their words." Alexander turned back to face her. "But you didn't misunderstand." "No," she said firmly. Their discussion was detailed and specific. Takeshi even referenced previous partnerships where they had used similar strategies. This isn't their first time implementing this kind of scheme. The revelation added another layer of horror to the situation. If Hashimoto had successfully executed this type of fraud before, there were likely other companies and inventors who had been victimized in similar ways. Alexander wondered how many other promising technologies had been perverted into inferior products that damaged both consumers and the reputation of legitimate innovation. "I need to think," Alexander said, his mind spinning through possible responses. "If I confront them directly, they'll deny everything and possibly accelerate whatever timeline they're working on. If I simply refuse to sign, they'll want explanations that I can't provide without revealing that I know about their conversation." Min-jun nodded. "There's another complication. The contracts are structured so that walking away at this point would trigger significant penalty clauses. Your legal team would need weeks to find acceptable grounds for termination." Alexander had reviewed those penalty clauses himself. They were designed to prevent either party from abandoning the deal due to minor concerns or last-minute cold feet. The financial penalties for breach of contract would be substantial enough to impact his company's operations, though not enough to threaten its survival. "What would you do?" he asked Min-jun directly. She considered the question carefully. "I would find a way to document their intentions before making any decisive moves. Right now, it's my word against theirs, and I'm just a translator. But if there were a way to record them discussing their actual plans..." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Alexander understood the implication, but the ethical and legal complexities were staggering. Recording business partners without their knowledge crossed numerous professional and legal boundaries, even if the purpose was to expose their fraudulent intentions. "The meeting is supposed to resume in 10 minutes, Alexander observed, checking his watch. "They'll expect a signing ceremony followed by the traditional dinner celebration, which gives us very little time to decide on a course of action," Min-jun agreed. Alexander found himself facing the most consequential decision of his professional career. In the span of 20 minutes, his understanding of the situation had been completely transformed. The triumphant culmination of months of negotiations had become a trap that threatened not just his business interests, but his fundamental integrity as an innovator. The knock on the conference room door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Chen?" His assistant's voice carried through the heavy wood. "The Hashimoto delegation is ready to resume." "Give us 2 more minutes," Alexander called back, then turned to Min-jun. "If you're wrong about this, if there's any possibility that you misunderstood their conversation, walking away from this deal will cost my company millions of dollars and damage relationships that took years to build." "I understand the stakes," Min-jun replied. "And I understand that you have no reason to trust my interpretation over a multi-billion-dollar business opportunity. But I also know what I heard. And I know that doing nothing makes me complicit in a fraud that will ultimately harm thousands of people." Alexander studied her face one more time, searching for any sign of uncertainty or hidden agenda. What he saw was a woman who had risked her professional reputation to warn him about a betrayal she could have easily ignored. The courage required for that action spoke to a character that he had never fully appreciated during their 18 months of working together. "If we're going to do this," he said finally, "we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. One mistake could expose us to legal liability while still allowing them to escape with my technology." Min-jun nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Alexander's expression hardened as he began to formulate a plan. "If they're planning to defraud me, they'll need to communicate those plans to their manufacturing teams and legal advisors. Those communications will leave traces, and if we can document their fraudulent intentions through their own words and actions, we'll have grounds for both criminal and civil proceedings." "That could take weeks or months," Min-jun pointed out. "Meanwhile, they'll have access to your technology and potentially begin implementing their scheme." "Not if I can delay the actual technology transfer while appearing to move forward with the partnership," Alexander replied. "The contracts include specific milestones for sharing technical specifications and manufacturing processes. If I can create reasonable delays in meeting those milestones while gathering evidence of their true intentions..." The plan was risky and complex, requiring him to maintain the appearance of good faith cooperation while secretly investigating his prospective partners. But it was the only approach that offered the possibility of both protecting his interests and exposing the Hashimoto family's fraudulent scheme. "I'll need your help," Alexander told Min-jun. "Not just as a translator, but as someone who can help me understand the cultural and linguistic nuances of their communications. Are you willing to take that risk?" Min-jun was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the personal and professional consequences of deeper involvement in what was essentially a corporate espionage operation. "My father never got justice for what was done to him," she said finally. "Maybe this is a chance to prevent the same thing from happening to someone else." The knock on the door came again, more insistent this time. Alexander straightened his jacket and checked his appearance in the reflection of the conference room window. In a few moments, he would need to return to the meeting and behave as if nothing had changed, even though Min-jun's revelation had fundamentally altered his understanding of everything. "One more question," he said to Min-jun as they prepared to rejoin the others. "In your professional opinion, how sophisticated is their operation? Are we dealing with opportunistic fraud, or something more systematic?" Min-jun's expression grew even more serious. "Based on the way Takeshi discussed previous partnerships and the detailed knowledge they demonstrated about regulatory loopholes, this is definitely systematic. They've been operating this way for years, possibly decades. The implications were staggering. If Min-jun was correct, the Hashimoto Corporation had built a significant portion of their business empire on systematically defrauding technology partners and producing inferior products that endangered consumers. The solar panel deal wasn't an aberration, it was simply their latest target. Alexander opened the conference room door, and they walked back into what now felt like a carefully orchestrated performance. The Japanese delegation had returned to their seats, their expressions pleasant and expectant. His own legal team sat ready with the contracts, their pens poised for what they assumed would be a routine signing ceremony. As Alexander took his seat at the head of the table, he caught Takeshi Hashimoto's eye and smiled with what he hoped appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. Shall we proceed with making history?" The response was warm and positive, exactly what he would have expected from partners eager to conclude a legitimate business deal. But now every smile seemed calculated, every gesture potentially part of an elaborate deception designed to steal his life's work and betray the consumers who would trust his technology. Min-jun settled into her chair beside him, her expression returning to its customary professional neutrality. But Alexander could sense the tension radiating from her, the awareness that they were now actively engaged in a dangerous game whose rules neither of them fully understood. The signing ceremony that followed would have to be perfect. Any sign that Alexander suspected their true intentions could cause the Hashimoto team to abandon their current approach and implement backup plans that might be even more difficult to detect and counter. For now, he needed to play the role of the trusting partner while secretly beginning the most complex investigation of his career. As Takeshi Hashimoto reached for his pen to begin the signing process, Alexander realized that this moment marked not the culmination of his business success, but the beginning of a battle that would test everything he had learned about human nature, corporate warfare, and the true cost of integrity in the modern business world. The pen felt unnaturally heavy in Alexander's hand as he signed his name across the bottom of the contract. Each stroke of ink represented not just his commitment to the partnership, but his entry into a dangerous game of deception that could either save his empire or destroy it entirely. Across the table, Takeshi Hashimoto's weathered face beamed with satisfaction as he added his own signature with ceremonial flourish. The champagne that followed tasted like ash in Alexander's mouth. The toasts spoke of mutual prosperity and technological advancement, words that now carried the bitter irony of knowing their true intentions. Min-jun sat quietly beside him, her face a masterpiece of professional composure, but Alexander could sense the tension coiled beneath her calm exterior. The traditional dinner celebration took place at Yongzik, one of Seoul's most prestigious restaurants, where the private dining room overlooked the Han River. The conversation flowed smoothly between Korean, Japanese, and English, with Min-jun providing seamless translation while Alexander mentally cataloged every word and gesture for future analysis. The Hashimoto delegation spoke enthusiastically about implementation timelines and market penetration strategies, painting pictures of success that Alexander now knew were elaborate facades. Kenji Hashimoto proved particularly talkative after his third glass of sake, regaling the table with stories of previous international partnerships that had exceeded expectations. Alexander listened with growing horror as he began to recognize the pattern Min-jun had warned him about. Each success story Kenji described involved technological innovations that had somehow failed to live up to their initial promise, always due to circumstances beyond Hashimoto's control. The most chilling moment came when Takeshi mentioned their partnership with a German renewable energy company 5 years earlier. Alexander knew the case well from industry publications. Brenner Solar had developed a revolutionary battery storage technology that promised to solve the intermittency problems plaguing solar energy adoption. Their partnership with Hashimoto for Asian distribution had initially appeared successful, but within 3 years, widespread battery failures had led to massive recalls, lawsuits, and ultimately Brenner's bankruptcy. At the time, industry analysts had blamed the failures on overly aggressive manufacturing cost reductions and inadequate quality control. Now Alexander understood that the failures had been deliberately engineered by Hashimoto's manufacturing processes, part of a systematic plan to acquire Brenner's technology while destroying their reputation and market position. The dinner stretched past midnight, with both sides maintaining the elaborate theater of celebration while Alexander's mind raced through the implications of what he had learned. By the time the evening concluded with promises to begin technology transfer within 2 weeks, he had formulated the broad outlines of his counterattack. The next morning found Alexander in his home office at dawn, surrounded by financial documents and legal files as he began the most complex investigation of his career. His first call was to Marcus Rodriguez, a former FBI agent who now ran a private investigation firm specializing in corporate fraud. Marcus had helped Alexander with due diligence investigations during previous acquisitions, but this assignment would test the limits of their professional relationship. Marcus arrived at Alexander's penthouse within 2 hours, his expression growing increasingly serious as Alexander outlined the situation. The investigator's weathered features reflected the skepticism of someone who had seen too many corporate conspiracy theories evaporate under scrutiny. "You're asking me to prove that one of Asia's most respected corporations is systematically defrauding technology partners," Marcus summarized after Alexander finished his explanation. "Based on a conversation that only your translator understood, which they'll certainly deny ever took place." Alexander nodded grimly. "I know how it sounds. But Min-jun has no motive to fabricate this story, and the pattern fits perfectly with what happened to Brenner Solar and at least 3 other companies I've identified since last night." Marcus pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "What kind of timeline are we working with?" "The technology transfer is scheduled to begin in 10 days, Alexander replied. "Once they have access to my manufacturing specifications and research data, they'll be able to implement their scheme regardless of any legal action I might pursue later." The investigator's expression remained skeptical, but his questions became more specific and practical. "I'll need complete financial records for Hashimoto Corporation, details of their previous partnerships, manufacturing facility inspections, and communication intercepts if possible. None of that will be easy to obtain legally, and some of it might be impossible." Alexander had anticipated this challenge. "I'm prepared to invest whatever resources are necessary. If they're planning to steal my technology and endanger consumers with defective products, I can't allow that to happen, regardless of the cost." Over the following week, Marcus assembled a team of specialists that included forensic accountants, industrial investigators, and technology experts. Their preliminary findings confirmed Alexander's worst fears while revealing additional layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. The forensic analysis of Hashimoto's financial records revealed a pattern of partnerships that followed a disturbingly consistent trajectory. Initial success and profitability would be followed by product failures, legal disputes, and ultimately the collapse or acquisition of the technology partner. In each case, Hashimoto emerged with ownership or control of valuable intellectual property, while avoiding significant liability for the failed products. More disturbing was the discovery that Hashimoto's manufacturing facilities in Thailand and Malaysia operated under regulatory frameworks that were riddled with loopholes and enforcement gaps. Products manufactured in these facilities were subject to minimal oversight, creating perfect conditions for the systematic quality compromises Min-jun had described. The investigation also uncovered evidence of sophisticated financial engineering designed to isolate Hashimoto's core assets from liability claims. The manufacturing operations were structured through a complex web of subsidiary companies and shell corporations that could be abandoned if legal problems became too severe. Meanwhile, the intellectual property acquired through their fraudulent partnerships was held by separate entities incorporated in jurisdictions with strong asset protection laws. But the most shocking discovery came from interviews with former Hashimoto employees who had been willing to speak confidentially about their experiences. 3 separate sources confirmed that the company maintained detailed profiles of potential technology partners, including assessments of their financial vulnerability, legal resources, and likelihood of pursuing extended litigation. Alexander realized he wasn't dealing with opportunistic fraud, but with a predatory business model that had been refined through decades of implementation. The Hashimoto Corporation was essentially a technology acquisition machine that used legitimate partnerships as cover for systematic theft and consumer endangerment. The evidence Marcus's team had gathered would eventually support criminal charges and civil litigation, but it wouldn't prevent the immediate threat to Alexander's technology. The contracts he had signed gave Hashimoto legal access to his research data and manufacturing specifications, regardless of their fraudulent intentions. Any attempt to withhold that information would constitute breach of contract and expose Alexander to significant financial penalties. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chen, Alexander's chief technology officer and younger sister, had been analyzing the technical requirements for the technology transfer when she identified a critical vulnerability in Hashimoto's approach. They're assuming they can simply copy our manufacturing processes and implement them in their facilities, Sarah explained during a tense family meeting in Alexander's office. But our solar cell technology depends on precise temperature controls and material purity standards that their facilities can't maintain without substantial upgrades. Alexander felt the first stirring of hope he had experienced since Min-jun's revelation. What kind of upgrades? The kind that would cost tens of millions of dollars and take at least 18 months to implement properly, Sarah replied. If they try to manufacture our panels using their existing equipment and quality control standards, the products will fail even faster than they're planning. The implications were staggering. Hashimoto's scheme depended on producing panels that would meet initial quality standards while failing predictably after the warranty period expired. But if their manufacturing processes were fundamentally incompatible with Alexander's technology, the panels would fail immediately, making the fraud obvious and legally actionable. Alexander began to see the outline of a strategy that could turn Hashimoto's predatory approach against them. Instead of trying to prevent the technology transfer, he could ensure that the transfer included technical requirements that would make their fraud impossible to implement successfully. The plan required extraordinary precision and careful legal maneuvering. Alexander needed to fulfill his contractual obligations by providing the promised technical specifications, while structuring those specifications in ways that would expose Hashimoto's fraudulent intentions. If executed properly, their own scheme would become the evidence needed to destroy them. Working with Sarah and his legal team, Alexander began preparing technical documentation that appeared complete and comprehensive while containing subtle requirements that would be impossible to meet using substandard manufacturing processes. The specifications included precise material purity standards, temperature control requirements, and quality testing protocols that would reveal any attempts to use inferior components. More importantly, the documentation included mandatory reporting requirements that would create a detailed paper trail of Hashimoto's manufacturing decisions. Every deviation from the specified standards would need to be documented and justified, creating evidence that could later be used to prove their fraudulent intent. The strategy carried enormous risks. If Hashimoto's technical team identified the trap before implementing it, they could modify their approach or abandon the partnership entirely. Alexander would then face breach of contract claims while losing the opportunity to expose their broader pattern of fraud. But the alternative was accepting the theft of his technology and the endangerment of thousands of consumers who would trust products bearing his innovations. The choice ultimately wasn't difficult to make. Min-jun proved invaluable during the implementation phase of Alexander's counterattack. Her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge helped identify communication patterns and decision-making processes within the Hashimoto organization that Marcus's investigators had missed. More importantly, her position as the official translator gave her access to internal discussions that provided early warning of Hashimoto's reactions to Alexander's technical requirements. The first signs of trouble appeared during a video conference reviewing the preliminary technical specifications. Alexander watched carefully as Min-jun translated increasingly heated discussions among the Japanese engineering team. Their frustration with the complexity and precision of his requirements was evident, but they seemed to interpret the challenges as evidence of superior technology rather than deliberate obstacles. Takeshi Hashimoto himself joined the call to address his team's concerns, speaking directly to Alexander with his characteristic grandfatherly warmth. "Mr. Chen, your technical standards are impressively rigorous. Our engineers are excited by the challenge of meeting such exacting requirements." Min-jun's translation carried subtle undertones that Alexander had learned to recognize. The enthusiasm in Takeshi's voice was genuine, but it reflected confidence in their ability to circumvent rather than meet the specified standards. They were still planning to implement their fraud, apparently believing they could find ways around the technical obstacles. The crucial test came 2 weeks later when Hashimoto's manufacturing team attempted their first production run using Alexander's specifications. The results exceeded even Sarah's pessimistic predictions. The solar panels produced using substandard materials and inadequate quality controls failed catastrophically during initial testing, with efficiency ratings less than half of what the technology promised. The failure should have prompted immediate reassessment of their manufacturing approach and substantial investments in facility upgrades. Instead, intercepted communications revealed that Hashimoto's leadership was pressuring their engineers to find ways to manipulate the testing protocols and falsify quality certifications. Alexander finally had the evidence he needed. The documented attempts to circumvent quality standards and falsify test results provided clear proof of fraudulent intent that would support both criminal charges and civil litigation. More importantly, the evidence had been generated by Hashimoto's own actions in response to legitimate technical requirements. But the investigation had also revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise and the number of previous victims who had never received justice. Alexander realized that exposing this single fraud wouldn't be enough. The entire predatory business model needed to be dismantled to prevent future victims. The decision to expand his counterattack beyond self-defense marked a fundamental transformation in Alexander's approach to business and his understanding of corporate responsibility. What had begun as an effort to protect his own interests had evolved into a mission to expose systemic fraud that had damaged the renewable energy industry for decades. Working with Marcus's investigative team and a coalition of attorneys representing previous Hashimoto victims, Alexander began building a comprehensive case that would target not just the fraudulent partnership, but the entire network of shell companies and corrupt practices that enabled their crimes. The legal strategy was complex and ambitious, involving coordination between multiple jurisdictions and regulatory agencies. Criminal charges would be filed in South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and Malaysia, while civil litigation would target Hashimoto's assets in more than a dozen countries, where they had hidden wealth stolen from previous victims. The breakthrough came when Min-jun identified a pattern in Hashimoto's internal communications that revealed the location of detailed records documenting their previous fraudulent partnerships. The records were stored in a private server farm in Singapore, apparently maintained as insurance against potential prosecution or internal betrayal. Obtaining legal access to those records required months of careful legal maneuvering and international cooperation, but the contents exceeded everyone's expectations. The documents revealed not just the details of individual fraudulent partnerships, but evidence of systematic corruption involving government officials, regulatory agencies, and financial institutions across multiple countries. The scale of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Over 30 years, the Hashimoto network had systematically defrauded technology companies, endangered millions of consumers, and corrupted regulatory systems designed to protect public safety. The stolen intellectual property had been used to build a corporate empire worth billions of dollars, while the legitimate innovators who created that technology had been destroyed or marginalized. Alexander found himself at the center of what legal experts described as one of the most complex international fraud cases in corporate history. The investigation had expanded to involve law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and courts in more than 20 countries, while the evidence continued to reveal new victims and criminal activities. The personal cost of the investigation was enormous. Alexander's company had spent millions of dollars on legal fees and investigative expenses, while the uncertainty surrounding the Hashimoto partnership had frozen other business development opportunities. The stress of managing the complex legal strategy while maintaining normal business operations had taken a severe toll on his health and personal relationships. But the investigation had also revealed aspects of his own character and values that Alexander had never fully understood. The comfortable world of corporate success and financial achievement that had defined his adult life seemed increasingly hollow compared to the satisfaction of fighting for justice and protecting others from the predatory practices he had discovered. Min-jun's role in the investigation had evolved far beyond translation services. Her linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and moral courage had been essential to every phase of the counterattack against Hashimoto's fraud. More importantly, her willingness to risk her career and personal safety to expose the truth had inspired Alexander to pursue justice even when the personal costs became overwhelming. The relationship between them had also evolved in ways that neither had anticipated. What began as a professional translator-client arrangement had developed into a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and complementary skills. Alexander had come to rely on Min-jun's judgment and insights, not just for translation, but for strategic decisions and moral guidance. The romantic dimension of their relationship developed gradually, emerging from the intense collaboration and shared purpose of their fight against Hashimoto's fraud. But both understood that any personal relationship would need to wait until the legal battles were concluded and the ethical complexities of their professional partnership were resolved. The climax of the legal campaign came 18 months after Min-jun's initial revelation in the Seoul conference room. Coordinated raids in 6 countries resulted in the arrest of 12 Hashimoto executives, the seizure of billions of dollars in assets, and the recovery of stolen intellectual property belonging to dozens of victimized companies. Takeshi Hashimoto himself was arrested at his Tokyo mansion, the grandfatherly patriarch finally exposed as the architect of one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud schemes in modern history. His son Kenji and nephew were taken into custody at their respective offices, while law enforcement agencies froze the assets of more than 50 shell companies and subsidiary organizations. The evidence presented at the trials revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise and its impact on both the technology industry and consumer safety. Millions of defective products had been sold worldwide, resulting in property damage, environmental contamination, and, in some cases, serious injuries and deaths. The systematic theft of intellectual property had distorted entire market sectors and prevented countless innovations from reaching consumers. For Alexander, the conclusion of the criminal trials marked not an ending but a transformation. The experience of fighting Hashimoto's fraud had fundamentally changed his understanding of corporate responsibility and the proper use of wealth and influence. The comfortable pursuit of profit and market dominance that had driven his early career seemed inadequate compared to the satisfaction of protecting others and promoting genuine innovation. The financial settlement from the Hashimoto litigation provided resources for a new phase of Alexander's career, focused on supporting legitimate innovation and protecting technology companies from predatory practices. The foundation he established became a model for industry self-regulation and consumer protection, while his advocacy for stronger international cooperation in corporate fraud prevention influenced policy changes in multiple countries. Min-jun's courage in exposing the fraud had made her a celebrated figure in the international business community, but she chose to remain focused on the practical work of helping other victims recover from similar fraudulent schemes. Her expertise in cross-cultural communication and fraud detection made her an invaluable resource for law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies worldwide. The technology that had originally attracted Hashimoto's predatory attention was eventually licensed to legitimate manufacturers who implemented it according to proper standards and quality controls. The solar panels, produced using Alexander's innovations, achieved their promised performance and longevity, contributing to significant advances in renewable energy adoption across multiple continents. But perhaps the most important outcome of the entire ordeal was Alexander's recognition that true success couldn't be measured solely in financial terms or market dominance. The satisfaction of protecting others from fraud and promoting genuine innovation had provided a sense of purpose and fulfillment that purely commercial achievements had never delivered. The lessons learned from fighting Hashimoto's fraud influenced every aspect of Alexander's subsequent business decisions. Due diligence processes were enhanced to identify potential partners with predatory histories, while contract structures were designed to protect both intellectual property and consumer safety. More importantly, Alexander's company adopted policies that prioritized long-term innovation and social responsibility over short-term profit maximization. The relationship with Min-jun that had begun with professional translation services evolved into a personal and business partnership that combined their complementary skills in service of shared values. Their marriage, 2 years after the conclusion of the Hashimoto trials, was celebrated by colleagues and friends who had witnessed their courage in fighting fraud and protecting others from corporate predation. Looking back on the events that began with a whispered revelation in a Seoul conference room, Alexander understood that Min-jun's decision to warn him about Hashimoto's fraud had saved more than just his business empire. It had revealed the person he was capable of becoming when faced with the choice between comfortable self-interest and the difficult work of fighting for justice and protecting others. The empire that Alexander ultimately built was different from the one he had originally envisioned. It was smaller in some ways, less focused on pure financial growth and market dominance, but it was also more meaningful, more sustainable, and more aligned with the values and principles that he had discovered through the crucible of fighting corporate fraud. The whispered words in Korean that had threatened to destroy his empire had ultimately transformed it into something far more valuable than he had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.